And welcome once again to Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific, brought to you by our producer, IEJ Media, and our sponsor, Bauer Group Asia. We will tell you more about them in due course. In New York, with the sun going down behind him, sitting outside once again, we have my co-host, Jim Carouso. How are you, Jim?
I'm enjoying a midsummer evening talking to you guys.
All right. Well, hopefully it won't get too dark there during the middle of this podcast for our YouTube listeners so they can still see your pretty face.
I'm always better on audio anyway.
Face made for radio. Well, today we want to talk about Taiwan because recently they had unprecedented recall elections on July 26th when voters rejected attempts to remove 24 opposition Kuomintang lawmakers from office, dealing a significant blow to President Lai Ching-te's Democratic Progressive Party and their hopes to regain the parliamentary majority that they lost last year. So, looking for a way to understand all this, we reached out to our friend Kharis Templeman. He's a research fellow at the Hoover Institution, which makes him my neighbor, and a manager of the project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific there. So, Kharis, welcome. And why should our international audience care about a series of failed recall elections in Taiwan? And specifically, what elevates this from mere domestic politics to an issue of global importance?
Yeah, so the recall elections are, I think, globally important because they affect Taiwan's own preparations to face off against the threat from the PRC. They're one way to frame this is that there's an opposition majority in the legislature that's rejected some of the measures that President Lai and his administration are trying to take to make Taiwan a more resilient and better prepared political entity to resist Beijing's pressure in various ways. And so the recall elections were an attempt to change the makeup of the legislature in a more China skeptical direction, I'll say. And so the failure of those means that Taiwan is in the same situation that it's been in over the last 18 months with divided government. So they've got a president and an executive branch of the Democratic Progressive Party, the more skeptical of the main political parties in Taiwan of the PRC. And the opposition is controlled by a coalition of the KMT, which is the more China-friendly party, and the TPP, the Taiwan People's Party, which is a more centrist party. And that opposition coalition has surprised some people by operating seemingly in lockstep on a lot of issues and opposing the Lai administration's efforts in some areas to strengthen its own defenses and civil resilience.
So, Kharis, it seems that asking for a recall is a pretty serious step. Yeah. Now, you really don't want to do that unless you're pretty confident you're going to win. Yeah. And it looks instead like Lai and company were embarrassed. Did they not analyze this correctly?
Well, so the first thing to note is that Lai and the DPP didn't initiate the recall movement. There's a bunch of, as near as I can tell, a bunch of grassroots organizations, activists who lean to the green side of the spectrum, but are not directly working with the DPP. Who got
the green side in Taiwan being the DPP.
Yeah, sorry, I should clarify. The green side being the DPP, the blue side being the KMT. So the green side is associated with the president, the blue is associated with the legislature here. And the social activists initiated on their own, as near as we can tell, their own efforts, recalls against some of the most polarizing leaders of the KMT caucus in the legislature. And it was only in the last couple of months, actually, that Lai publicly announced that he was going to encourage the DPP to support the recall efforts. So he kind of joined late. He may well have been working behind the scenes, or at least other parts of the DPP working behind the scenes to help gather signatures. I should note the recall process in Taiwan, although it's not impossible to pass a recall. It takes a lot of manpower to actually go out and obtain the signatures you need to qualify for a recall. So there's a two-stage process. First, you have to get the signatures of 1% of all the eligible voters in the district. And then you have 60 days once that qualifies and is certified as qualified to go out and get the signatures of an additional 10% of the electorate. And so the signature gathering process it requires a huge amount of manpower. And so to their credit, the civil activist groups that got involved in this actually really supplied that manpower. They were really, they were driven, I think, by a lot of anger and like deep concern about the KMT legislators' activities over the last 18 months. And so they were able to qualify a surprising number of recalls for the ballot. 24 is over 2/3 of the legislative caucus of the KMT. So, and then there's an additional 7 who are facing another recall in a month. So, it was there were many surprises here, and one was just how many legislators were facing a recall, because it didn't look like that in the initial kind of activation of these networks that these would qualify.
So help our audience to understand the Kuomintang, because obviously, so we had Victor Chin, who is the Kuomintang's representative in the United States, on the podcast several months ago. And of course, the KMT would reject the label of being sort of the pro-Beijing party. It seems to those of us on the outside that Beijing clearly prefers the KMT to the DPP, since Beijing makes no bones about it. They really, really did not want Lai Ching-te to win the last election. They were not exactly quiet about that. So how should we understand the role of the KMT in Taiwan today?
Yeah, well, the KMT it's the oldest political party in Taiwan. It was the dominant party for decades. In fact, was the party of the party state regime for over 40 years under an authoritarian system. But then it also reformed itself pretty deeply in the transition to democracy. So today, it's in a position where it's got a base among the old mainlander immigrant generation in Taiwan and their descendants. So people who came over with the ROC regime in 1949 when they lost to the communists. But during their decades on Taiwan, particularly after the 1970s, the party integrated a lot of what we talk about as native Taiwanese, so non-mainlanders, islanders, effectively, who were either living in 1949 on the island or are the descendants of people who were there before 49. And so that kind of ethnic cleavage has dissipated a lot over the last 30 years. And so now the KMT gets as much support from so-called native Taiwanese as it does from the mainlanders and their descendants. But I mention that history because the party itself has a certain amount of, a little bit of a kind of mixed identity in the same way that Taiwan does. The party was founded on mainland China. It was the party that created and oversaw the evolution of the Republic of China constitution and their institutions on the mainland. For decades, its publicly stated goal was to oversee Taiwan's transformation into a last bastion of non-communist, a kind of non-communist outpost, and to prepare itself to retake the mainland. And so it's not really until the 1980s that the party kind of disavowed that goal and moved to become a more kind of Taiwan-centric party. And so there's still there's a lot of kind of historical baggage that the party has, to put it bluntly. It's, the former authoritarian party had a huge number of resources, some of which it acquired in dubious circumstances from the state or from its Japanese predecessors. It would use those to win elections. And so there's still a lot of kind of a negative set of legacies from the authoritarian era that it carries with it. But it was also the party that presided over decades of economic growth and can claim the mantle of the party that oversaw the economic miracle in Taiwan and that created the foundations for, Taiwan's semiconductor industry today. All of that also happened under the rule of this party. And so they kind of have a strong brand when it comes to economic management as well. And then the last piece is the party during the Ma Ying-jeou era made the case to the Taiwan people that it could manage cross-strait relations better than the DPP. And I think it demonstrated that, Beijing will talk to it, Beijing will not talk to the DPP. And as a consequence, if you want better cross-strait relations, vote for the KMT. And you don't have to give up sovereignty and security to do that. The KMT will protect those, or at least they claim to. But they view their kind of comparative advantage in the Taiwan political spectrum as being the party that can at least stabilize the cross-strait relationship and maintain reasonably positive relations with Beijing.
Gentlemen, I'm going to have to move inside. I neglected to say the light attracts every insect in the county. So I'm going to.
All right. Let's go ahead and pause.
Okay. Now that I've moved inside away from the insects, Kharis, I'm still confused about KMT, the party of Chiang Kai-shek, famous anti-communist, is now seen by the Communist Party in mainland China as being more pro-China. Explain to me the dichotomy.
Yeah. So the KMT's founding kind of myth was that they were the party that would build up the Republic of China, establish an anti-communist or kind of Republican nationalist regime on the mainland. But that also meant that they were vehemently anti-Taiwan independence when they were founded and when they came to Taiwan. And so over the decades, the kind of anti-communist flavor of the party has softened a bit, in part because the PRC itself has dramatically changed from what it was like in the 50s and 60s. Starting in 1979, of course, there's the reform and opening up periods in the PRC. And the KMT itself actually sees, in some ways, a kind of a regime that's more interested in following what they would characterize as the Taiwan path towards modernization and economic development. So actually, many people who had ties to the KMT helped the PRC in the 80s and 90s kind of plug into the global economy. The Taiwanese, in fact, were probably the best positioned of any group in the world to kind of benefit from China's opening up to global markets. They had, shared language, a shared culture, a kind of shared understanding of the business opportunities that might come in the West. And they also were facing their own kind of labor market squeeze in Taiwan. And so they were looking for new places to establish manufacturing where they could do it more cheaply. And so the kind of rise of China has a fair amount to do with the rise of the Taiwanese global entrepreneur plugging into the Chinese market and then acting as a sort of middleman and almost as a kind of teacher or instructor to Chinese mainlanders who wanted to try to develop customers around the world. And so the KMT has, benefited a fair amount from that. And that's kind of fundamentally shifted their ideology away from the idea that the mainland is irrevocably communist, that they are irrevocably, they're just an unacceptable enemy, implacable enemy of the Nationalist Party. And in fact, once you kind of take the economics out of the equation, then on other dimensions, the KMT and the CCP look a lot alike. At least they did when they were founded. The KMT was founded as a kind of Leninist, democratic, centralized party in the same way that the CCP was. And a fair number of kind of KMT elites came from mainland villages, and they go back to those villages and meet relatives who now work for the Communist Party, right? And so there's a kind of, I don't want to exaggerate this, but there is in some cases a real kind of family tie for members of the KMT who did come to Taiwan or whose ancestors did in 1949 with the mainland.
Okay, so let's go ahead and bring us up to date here, starting with, we had the election of President Lai took the place of Tsai Ing-wen, another DPP president, which again, as I mentioned before, was vocally opposed by Beijing, and then we had this election, this parliamentary election, in which they lost a lot of seats to this new coalition we're talking about, this coalition between the KMT and this thing called the TPP, which we can probably explain a little bit. And so that brought us into this situation that generated this recall election. And I guess let's set it up like this. What are the forces at work here? Why is it, first of all, why were these activists so upset that they generated this recall election? And then why did they lose?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I'll go a little political sciencey on here with my answer. And I think the most fundamental reason is that there was a fair amount of uncertainty after the 2024 election results were announced. And so to use a kind of jargony term, I think that the political system was in a state of disequilibrium where the three main political parties, the DPP, the KMT, and this new Taiwan People's Party, didn't know, number one, whether the recall mechanism would function or how it would function. And so I should back up here and say this was a 4-year term that the legislators were all elected to. And so Taiwan voters effectively said, you're going to have divided government for the next 4 years, unless something extraordinary happens, right? And so the DPP, the KMT, and the TPP weren't really sure how divided government was going to work. There's only one previous time in Taiwan's democratic history where they had a president of one party and an opposition controlling the legislature. And that was during the Chen Shui-bian era. And the precedent there is not great. There's a lot of similar kind of dynamic where the opposition and the DPP government were constantly looking for ways to kind of win a power struggle with the other side. And so there's a lot of uncertainty about how divided government would work. There's a lot of uncertainty about the TPP, especially, and whether it would side with the DPP, with the KMT, or whether it would kind of swing between the two. And then there's a lot of uncertainty as well about just how solid that KMT plurality was in the legislature. I should note the KMT won only one more seat than the DPP did in that election. And on the basis of having one more seat, they were claiming that they were the rightful opposition, that they had control of the legislature, and that they could really set the agenda for the country. And the DPP government should cede a lot of authority to them in the legislature. If you actually go through the election returns in 2024, the KMT legislative, the legislative district legislators actually won 5% less of the vote than the DPP legislative district legislators. And the reason they came out one seat ahead is some malapportionment in the Taiwanese legislative electoral system. So the KMT was on pretty shaky ground in claiming that they had a strong mandate from the voters to oppose everything that the DPP did in government. And so a lot of analysts, myself included, expected that there would be some kind of moderation, both from the DPP and the KMT, with the TPP kind of swinging between the two blocks on a kind of issue by issue basis, going into this new 4-year cycle with divided government. And I say all of that because that's not what happened, in fact. The KMT actually moved very aggressively to try to increase their powers relative to the executive branch. They, as soon as Lai took office, in fact, the KMT-TPP coalition passed a bill that basically gave themselves much greater oversight powers. So they could require members of the executive branch to testify. They could be punished for not providing secret documents. There was even a clause in there requiring the president to come to the legislature and be questioned by legislators. And so they basically took a big swing to try to get as much sort of institutional authority to pull as much towards the legislature as they could very early on in Lai's term. And the backlash to that was driven by people who thought, you don't really have a mandate to do that, right? And the DPP, of course, encouraged that and said, that Lai is the president, not the legislature. Lai can oversee the executive branch. And this is an overreach. This is a power grab that is illegitimate. And so really from the first days of this administration, there has been a kind of attempt to stake out a very kind of aggressive interpretation of what the legislature's powers are. And the executive branch, in turn, has responded by taking a kind of aggressive stance in opposition and saying, no, actually, none of what you are claiming are you really able to do. And so it's because of the uncertainty of how divided government will work and the lack of any kind of precedent for this situation, I think that both the KMT and DPP have been pretty aggressive in pushing their position.
So what happens now?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think we have more information now than we did 18 months ago. One is that you're not going to change the composition of the legislature. This is not a kind of temporary situation where the public is now fully behind the DPP. And I think that's what the activists were hoping would happen. And so there was not a whole lot of incentive on the DPP side to compromise when you still had the possibility that the recalls could change control of the legislature. Lai, I'm sure, would have loved to have, a DPP majority and not have to worry about this. And he's happy to wait. If he can just outweight the opposition and these recalls succeed, then he doesn't have to deal with these issues in the future. Now that option is precluded. There's no way the legislature is going to flip to the Green side. On the KMT side, I know for a fact they were actually pretty nervous that a lot of these KMT legislators would go down to defeat, that they would be recalled. And so they actually, in many ways, have kind of softened their rhetoric and changed their behavior a little bit over the last few months as a result of the recalls that have been brought against them. And so it's possible that you could see a KMT caucus that is more willing now to kind of negotiate with the executive branch before they push something very controversial through. And it's possible, I hope, that you've got a Lai administration now that recognizes that they just don't have the votes in the legislature. They're going to have to pay a price. They're going to have to compromise with the opposition if they want to get their agenda through. And that they need to kind of come hat in hand and say, let's let bygones be bygones and actually talk. And
now, but there's actually yet another recall still to happen, right? So are we in a little bit of suspended, and talk about that, and are we a little bit of a suspended animation until that happens?
Yeah, I think so. It's theoretically possible that those recalls could succeed so there's 7 more legislators up for recall in a month. The reason those are not at the same time is that the process of qualifying the recall for the ballot was a little more drawn out. They had more trouble gathering signatures in those districts. And so I suspect that these districts will be even harder for the opposition or for the DPP, pro-DPP camp to flip than the ones that were already on the ballot in the recall last weekend. And so that seems to be the conventional wisdom in the Taiwan press as well, that if the DPP couldn't win this current round, then the next round it's a bigger reach. It's hopeless, basically. And so the momentum really does seem to have gone out of the recall movement now as a result of these results. again, it's theoretically possible, but we may be in a state of suspended animation for another month. But certainly after those recalls are done, I think there's almost no chance that the legislature. Certainly no chance that the legislature flips. I think there's almost no chance that any of those passes at this point.
Will the coalition feel even more empowered to challenge Lai and try and take back more power?
They could. The other factor here is that both the KMT and the TPP, their small coalition partner, are already eyeing the 2026 local elections, and they're concerned about kind of positioning some of their members to run in those elections. And so if they're some of the analysis I've seen suggests that they may actually try to moderate their image a little bit with the hope that they can perform well in those elections. Those are a little over a year away, year and 4 months roughly. But in the Taiwan kind of electoral cycle, that's actually not a whole lot of time. So this might be the optimist in me talking, but I suspect that the TPP and the KMT will find a more receptive negotiating partner in the DPP, and there are at least some parts of the KMT who are looking for opportunities to cooperate or to compromise on some of these issues.
So let's talk a bit about Beijing. So would it be an appropriate framing to ask whether this event or this failed recall represents a victory for Beijing? And related to that, if so, what evidence do we have that Beijing was active in trying to shape this outcome?
Yeah. Beijing will certainly frame it that way. This is as they frame everything that goes against the DPP as a rejection of the Taiwan independence dead-end road, right? And they often use more florid language even than that to describe it. But I think it's mostly, if I had to come up with kind of one takeaway from this, it's that the voters aren't really enamored with either the green or the blue camp right now. Neither camp has a kind of clear advantage. And so if you're saying this is a sweeping defeat for the DPP, well, yeah, the DPP didn't gain any seats, but they didn't lose any either. We're in the exact same situation we were 18 months ago. Lai's popularity is about the same level that it was a few months ago. It's as a kind of institutional process, it's a defeat for the Green camp, but it's also not a sweeping endorsement of everything the KMT has done either. And so it also, I don't think voters, when they're going into the polling booth and deciding whether to recall their incumbent legislator, were thinking first and foremost about whether they supported or opposed independence or supported or opposed unification. So I think this was much more about the kind of partisan battle, DPP claiming the legislature was undermining national security or the national interest, and the opposition claiming that this was executive overreach. And, that I should note that the opposition, the activists involved in this were using a tool that has never been used on this scale before in Taiwan. That, and our instinct as outsiders, when we look at a kind of mass recall, is to say this looks like a kind of abuse of the recall system. The recalls, at least in the United States, are rarely used, and they're used against people who are just, egregiously incompetent or deeply problematic for some reason. You don't ever see this kind of mass recall really anywhere else in the world. And so I think, I don't have polling data on this, but it's consistent with my priors that to see this many voters turn out and to oppose recalls suggests that there was a kind of argument about democratic process here that voters wanted to weigh in on. And so that has very little to do with Beijing and much more to do with, should this mechanism be used willy-nilly for every legislator you don't like, or should it just be used in very special extreme circumstances.
Now, if I were a Taiwanese voter, which I'm not, I would be thinking, here we are faced with a potentially existential crisis for our country as Beijing ramps up the pressure, practices quarantines and blockades, the whole 2027 scenario. And here are politicians doing what looks like political games.
Yeah.
So is there a pox on both your houses, which you sort of mentioned? Is there anyone in the wings to lead the country in a crisis?
Well, so I should note a significant share of the Taiwanese electorate does not see the current moment as they don't have an elevated sense of crisis relative to a year or 2 or 5 years ago, right? So Taiwanese have grown up with this threat from across the strait their entire lives. And in some ways they're kind of, they've developed this sort of, discounting of the rhetoric coming out of Beijing. Beijing has threatened various leaders in Taiwan since 1996 and the third Taiwan Strait crisis, right? So to convince people that now is different and there needs to be a fundamental kind of shift in thinking and action and an acceleration of preparations for a hot conflict, it's actually a pretty hard sell in some parts of the Taiwan electorates. So
the government's done some things. They've increased the time of conscription. They're investing more in defense.
Yeah. And in fact, that's part of the political debate right now is whether the government, this is a DPP government doing these things. And part of the criticism from the KMT side is you wouldn't have to do these things if you just said the right things to Beijing. This is not about military armament. It's about using the right rhetoric to describe cross-strait relations. And the threats that Beijing makes are entirely due to what the DPP has done and said in the past. The DPP is provoking this rather than Beijing kind of actively pushing it. And
Here's those like the PRC line.
Yeah. I mean, but there's a market for that in part of the Taiwanese electorate. And I should note, I don't think this is, it's certainly not mostly Beijing's sort of nefarious underground activities influencing this. This is a longstanding kind of position of the blue end of the political spectrum that the way to deal with the PRC threat is to negotiate, to engage with them. And in fact, the last KMT government that Taiwan had under Ma Ying-jeou did that. They negotiated and they struck a bunch of agreements. And in the KMT's view, things were a lot better up until 2016. And it's only after 2016 when the DPP took over and didn't express some form of the one China principle in its description of the cross-strait relationship that Beijing then felt compelled to pressure Taiwan. And so all of the sort of military buildup, the saber rattling, the economic coercion, the gray zone activities, all of that is due to the DPP not sticking with the KMT playbook.
So let's bring it up to date in American terms, because just yesterday we had the news come out that Lai Ching-te, who was supposed to pass through the United States on a trip abroad, was supposed to drop into New York, and that has been rejected by the Trump administration. How does that fit into the context of all of this? And what is the precedent for denying the sort of logistical stop, if you will, or at least, not a non-official visit of a Taiwanese president? And how is that likely to play both in Taiwan and with Beijing?
Yeah, so, I mean, Beijing wants that. This was pretty clearly, I think, in response to pressure from Beijing. And my understanding of the politics in the White House right now is that President Trump is prioritizing some kind of trade negotiation with the PRC. And this happens all the time in US-Taiwan relations where there's some kind of executive branch concern about China or some kind of priority about China, and Taiwan is a problem in that relationship. And so if you could just make Taiwan go away, keep it quiet, avoid rocking the boat during this sensitive time in negotiations, then we can get what we really need, and then we can revert back to a more kind of our more normal approach to U.S.-Taiwan relations. The problem is every time is a sensitive time in the U.S.-China relationship. It's been that way for decades. And so the PRC consistently kind of manipulates this. If there's something that the U.S. is trying to achieve in the bilateral relationship, they often use the Taiwan issue as a card to try to, or they try to use something that the U.S. wants from China as a way to get concessions on the Taiwan issue. And I should note those concessions are mostly symbolic or rhetorical. Lai can still do a transit through the United States, but he just can't go to New York City. And so there's a long precedent of the United States kind of deciding, kind of dialing up or down what they allow a Taiwan president to do in the United States on a so-called transit stop. At one extreme, Tsai Ing-wen, on one of her transit stops, was allowed to fly into LAX, hold a press conference in the airport, go visit the local TICO office, which no Taiwan leader had ever done before, and then go to the Ronald Reagan Presidential Library and give a speech in front of the Berlin Wall piece they have there. And that was all public. And she met McCarthy there too, Kevin McCarthy, then the Speaker of the House. That's kind of at the upper extreme of what the United States has done in this relationship. At the other extreme, in the very late George W. Bush era, President Bush at that point had zero trust in Chen Shui-bian as president of Taiwan, and Chen had requested a transit stop in the U.S., and they said, okay, you can refuel in Anchorage, Alaska in January, and we might let you leave the tarmac and go into the airport terminal building, but then you have to get back on the plane and continue on. And so the U.S. uses this sometimes as an indication of their displeasure or conversely, their cooperation or their trust in the Taiwan leadership. And sometimes it's simply a reflection of the U.S.-China relationship, their bilateral, whatever bilateral issues might be kind of driving concerns in the White House or the State Department. And so this kind of restriction on a transit visit is not unprecedented at all. It's actually more the norm over the decades. But it does kind of stick out. It looks like a reversal in contrast to the way things were over the last few years, where the U.S. kept kind of loosening the restrictions on each visit of a Taiwan leader when they came to the United States.
So what's so interesting now is, as you probably know, the U.S. apparently is pressuring Japan and Australia to commit now to joining us in any action to defend Taiwan.
Yeah.
And of course, those countries are saying, what? You guys won't even commit. You want us to commit before you do.
Yeah.
And I'm just wondering, in Taiwan, what is the relationship? How will they see the importance of Japan and Australian relations in maintaining Taiwanese sovereignty?
Yeah, well, so Japan is quite important for Taiwan, and there's a long-standing effort that crosses the partisan divide in Taiwan to try to deepen relations with the Japanese government, with civil society actors. Mill to mill is not really a thing, but kind of civilian security analysts is actually a thing now, and the Taiwan side has always wanted to do more of that because they view Japan as second only to the United States in terms of its importance for Taiwan's security. The Japan side has actually moved a lot, as far as I can tell, on this issue in recent years. They've moved quietly. A lot of the interchange between the two sides happens in private settings, well below the radar. But they've come up with creative ways to get around the fact that Japan and Taiwan do not have formal diplomatic relations. So for a while, the DPP and the LDP were having party-to-party talks regularly on various issues of common concern. And that's kind of taking a page out of the KMT's playbook, where they have party-to-party talks with the CCP and bypass if the government in Taiwan is controlled by the DPP, they just bypass the government then. So Japan is really important. Australia is important in the sense that it's part of the broader U.S. coalition that would come to Taiwan's rescue if there were actually a military action against Taiwan. But Taiwan is in a position where they have very little leverage. They have very little influence over this. And so their top diplomatic priority is to keep relations with Washington good. And I think their second top priority is to keep relations with Japan in a good place.
Well, Kharis, we are coming up on time. I want to thank you for all that you shared with us and sort of filling in a lot of the gaps in our own knowledge. If people want to get more of your knowledge, where can they follow your work?
So I'm a fellow at the Hoover Institution. We run a regular speaker series here on Taiwan politics and security issues. So you can check out our website at the Hoover Institution. The project is called the Project on Taiwan and the Indo-Pacific Region. I also have my own personal website, and I blog there occasionally. And then I do a fair number of public speaking events as well. And so if you just Google me, I have a very unusual name, so I'm easy to track down. And so if there's something coming up, chances are, a quick Google search will find me there.
All right. Well, Kharis with a KH, we want so for our listeners' benefit, so that as they're Googling, they can go find that. We do thank you for joining us. And once again, our sponsor is Bauer Group Asia, a strategic advisory firm that specializes in the Indo-Pacific. Bauer Group applies unmatched expertise and experience to help clients navigate the world's most complex and dynamic markets. My colleague, Jim Carouso, here is a senior advisor with Bauer Group, and you can visit their website at BauerGroupAsia.com. Jim, I always feel like interpreting Taiwan's politics requires like a calculator and an abacus and a protractor. There's so many angles to everything. I think Kharis did a great job of sort of unpacking a lot of it, but I feel like we could sort of bring in 5 other people and get 5 very different interpretations of what just happened.
I'll go back to our conversation with the KMT rep in Washington, who I guess echoed the KMT view of we just have to say the right things and Beijing will be satisfied, which I have trouble believing. But apparently that split between those who say, just say nice things to Beijing, and those who say, no, that really doesn't work, is a major split in society and politics.
Yeah.
And the fact that split is perhaps widening with these recalls at a time when you and I have been watching Chinese activity against Taiwan increase every month, every day practically. It seems a dangerous situation.
Well, and of course, we have had another recent recording that hasn't yet aired, talking about that kind of split here in the Philippines, where I am right now, between those who sort of support the Rodrigo Duterte approach to China and those who support the Ferdinand Marcos more confrontational approach to China. So it's not unique to Taiwan, but it's probably more accentuated in Taiwan than anywhere else on the planet by a significant margin.
Well, I was reminded, as I sort of asked Kharis about how people are reacting in the face of an existential crisis, potentially focusing on these little things. So I have a story that sort of reflects my personal experience with not knowing what the hell's going on.
That's a hell of a segue.
You the little scooters?
Yes. You, sir, are a professional.
Yes. Well, semi-professional. So I was in high school in Greece, and I lived on the north side of Athens, and my girlfriend at the time lived on the south side of Athens. And so I would take the bus, actually 3 buses, to get down to see her. It was a long trip, took about an hour and a half. And I have to go right through the center of Athens. And as I'm coming home that night, I get off the bus, the streets are empty. Why is that, I wonder? And as I'm walking towards the university, which is where I catch my next bus home, my eyes start streaming down my face. And it's really hard to breathe. So I don't know if you've ever been tear gassed, but it's not fun.
No.
Not really not. Because it turns out that the students at the university were rioting against the military junta, and they'd been tear gassed, and there's still tear gas all around the university. And your friend, James, decides to walk right into the middle of that because I had to visit my girlfriend and I didn't know anything about coups and riots. I was interested in other things.
And very emotional, apparently, at that time.
Well, again, focus and being able to block out information that doesn't work for what I was focused on. And, and if I'm a Taiwanese businessman or someone, I'm worried about the economy. I'm worried about whatever's interest today. And as Kara said, this Taiwan thing's been going on for so long that they're sort of tuning it out.
And that, of course, for those of us who spend a lot of time studying the gray zone and wringing our hands about this, and I count myself among those people, that's what worries us, right? I mean, we worry that what is essentially happening is the whole boiling frog thing, is that essentially China is lulling their adversaries to sleep as they continue to increase control. And again, with the objective ultimately to gain all of their objectives without actually ever having to initiate conflict, which of course, nobody wants conflict. But if they gain everything they want to gain, if they are able to essentially absorb Taiwan, if they are essentially able to undermine the sovereignty of other neighbors, then they win anyway.
Ching-te, get the other side to surrender without firing a shot. So it's a little trick, but pretty good.
All right. Well, on that happy note, we will end another segment with what another podcast I listen to likes to call Crushing Morosity. But somebody who's not morose is our producer, Ian Ellis-Jones, and we thank him and IEJ Media for producing our podcast so faithfully. We also want to call your attention to all of those fantastic graphics and other presentations that he puts together over on his X page, which is at Ian Ellis-Jones. And of course, if you enjoyed this episode, you should subscribe and follow us right away. Please do that because we have been growing by leaps and bounds, but we obviously want to continue growing so that the algorithms keeps picking us up and suggesting us to more people. So you can go to YouTube at youtube.com @IP Podcast, or of course, we're on social media. We're on X, we're on LinkedIn, we are on Blue Sky. If you're interested in that discussion we had with Victor Shin of the KMT, that was episode 42. Why should we care about the Kuomintang, Taiwan's opposition party? And I think the events of this past week have proven why we should care. And of course, if you want to hear the other side of the aisle, you can listen to episode 62, where we had DPP member of Parliament Wang Ting-yu, who talked about why should we care if China is sabotaging Taiwan's subsea cables, and a number of other relevant topics that we talked about with MP Wang. Finally, of course, you can email us at Indo-Pacific-podcast@gmail.com. That's again, Indo-Pacific-podcast@gmail.com. We continue to get some great emails at that address. And you can, of course, visit our sponsor, which we encourage you to do, BauerGroupAsia.com. So for our sponsor and our producer, Ian, and for my co-host, Jim, I'm Ray. Thank you for joining us this time and next time on Why Should We Care About the Indo-Pacific.